Good evening. My name is Elena Harrison. On behalf of Social Policy Research Unit, Faculty of Social Work, I'd like to welcome you all here tonight. Thank you for coming. Social Policy Research Unit hosts a number of public events throughout the year, bringing in speakers who represent the idea of social justice in one form or another. Our events are free to attend, but you may have noticed a donation bucket at the back. We thank you for your donation, and it will go towards ensuring that we can continue to bring in great speakers like Percy Schmeiser tonight. One last note, in our speaker series, we allow time for after the presentation for a question and answer period. Please remember to keep your questions brief, concise, and on point if you could. I'd like to now ask Garson Hunter, Associate Professor with the Faculty of Social Work, to come forward and introduce Mr. Schmeiser.
Good evening, everyone. Just one short commercial before I get to the introduction. In 2 weeks' time, continuing with this series of speakers, we're going to have Brewster Dean speaking here from Toronto on cargo, on his books on Farmageddon and all of that. So 2 weeks' time, October 19th, 7:30. Same place, same time. I'd like to welcome everyone here to this evening's event on Treaty 4 land, Cree Soto land. You'll see our title for tonight's event, The Right of Farmers to Use Their Own Seed. I mean, what an Orwellian title for tonight's event. How did the historical, time-honored practice of farmers selecting the best seeds from their crops for forthcoming planting twist into the right that has to be argued within the legal system of the state? How did we as a society reach the point where courts decide between the collective practices of a group of people we call farmers and gardeners that use their traditional knowledge to select, save, swap, and replant seeds, and then the so-called rights of corporate plant breeders to patent the genetic material of life? I suppose that in retrospect it was foreseeable in a free-fall and aggressive capitalist economy where everything is a commodity. An economic structure where our inefficient for-profit food system produces a surplus of food and waste, while a portion of that waste ends up circulated through the food banks because of hunger. A society where hunger amongst plenty is not even a political event, a political statement, where our media, such as our own public CBC, becomes involved in fundraising drives for food banks. The CBC does not become involved in sponsoring abortion or capital punishment campaigns, but somehow hunger is not an issue of public justice. Or at least it's made not to be seen as a political issue of justice in the face of private charity. Seeds are not the commercial property of corporations. They did not invent them, nor is there evidence that they have improved them. According to the August 2009 Journal of Scientific American, agri-tech companies actively thwart independent seed research. Corporate plant breeders are stealing thousands of years of farming knowledge and practices from the farmers who develop and hold that knowledge. Their patents are assisted by the state and by the courts in that theft. It is the obligation of farmers to retrieve their seeds from corporations, and it is our duty to support those farmers worldwide. I mentioned Orwell before, so I thought I'd just read a brief quote from Orwell from his book, Road to Wicked Pier. There is still room for patches of cleanness and decency in our industrial world. That's an encouraging thought. In spite of hard trying, man has not yet succeeded in doing his dirt everywhere. The earth is vast and still empty, that even in the filthy heart of civilization, you can find fields where the grass is green instead of gray. Perhaps if you look for them, you might even find streams with live fish instead of salmon tins. Thankfully, there are patches of green like Percy, who bring the political nature of food and its production and distribution back into focus. Tonight's speaker is the recipient of the Alternative Nobel Peace Prize. It's called the Right to Livelihood Award. And he's also the recipient of the Mahatma Gandhi Award that strives for the betterment of humankind in a nonviolent way. It is a real privilege to introduce tonight's speaker, Percy Schmeiser.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of my wife and myself, it's a great pleasure to be with you here this evening in Regina. As many of you know, I come from the little town of Bruno, which is about 20 miles west of Humboldt. And I've lived there all my life. Part of my education was also in Bruno and the rest in other parts of our country. My wife and I were known for many, many years in our region as seed developers and seed savers in rapeseed or canola, as we now call it. And we had spent half a century developing new varieties of canola suitable for our climatic and soil condition in our region east of Saskatchewan. Now, I'm here this evening to talk to you about GMOs. Whatever you want to call it, genetic modified organisms, GE, genetic engineering, and so on. But I'd like always to refer to the term GMOs, genetic modified organisms. Now there's a lot of issues that arise when you talk about GMOs. And many of those issues are what happens to sustainable agriculture, biodiversity, intellectual property rights of corporations versus the property rights of farmers, food security and poverty, biotechnology and hunger. So there's many issues when you start talking about GMOs and the whole issues that arise from GMOs. Now, briefly, I'm going to just give a little background about GMOs. Introduced into North America, Canada, and the United States at exactly the same time, 1996. 4 crops were introduced, and that was corn, or maize if you want to call that, cotton, and soya, and especially by us in Canada, Western Canada, canola. So those were the 4 main crops introduced at that time, 1996. And what were farmers told, and even members of our government, about GMOs at that time? First of all, it was very confidential. A lot of people didn't even know what GMOs were. Farmers that grew it first in 1996 had to come to a special informational meeting of Monsanto and so on. But this is what people were told and farmers were told. First of all, increased yields, less chemicals, and more nutritious. And then you had also the buzzwords. Now with GMOs, we'd be able to feed with this new technology a hungry and starving world. We always would have sustainable agriculture. And believe me, after that introduction in 1996, by 1997, already things started to go the opposite way. The yields started going down. The protein or the nutritional value we have found was only maybe 50% of conventional or organic foods. But I think the worst thing that could have happened is the massive increased use of chemicals. And I think that's one of the reasons too that farmers started using, because chemicals are a very important input cost to farmers. And as you probably all know, we use chemicals by the hundreds of tons on the prairies every year. And so that was, I think, one of the main things. Then farmers found out with GMOs, they would start using more chemicals than ever before, and no more highly toxic and more stronger chemicals because of the new super weeds that developed, especially super weed canola plants that we never ever had before. And that super weed was not only in canola fields, it spread into our wheat fields, our barley fields, and throughout our whole country, into our golf courses, cemeteries, and so on. So it was now also a new expense for people that never grew canola. Our municipalities, wheat farmers, barley farmers, and so on. So everything started going wrong after even the first or second year. Now, I'll just briefly tell you what happened to my wife and myself. 2 years after the introduction, in 1998, Monsanto laid unexpectedly against what they called a patent infringement lawsuit against my wife and myself, where they said we were growing Monsanto's GMO canola without a license from them. And believe me, that was quite a surprise to us because we were seed developers in canola. And that would be the last thing that we would want to have is contamination of our canola that we worked many, many years for to develop suitable for our climatic and soil conditions. But primarily we were trying to develop canola that was resistant to certain diseases we have on the prairies in canola. So we stood up to Monsanto at that time, and she said to Monsanto, if you have contaminated what we worked so hard for 50 years, you should be liable for the damages you have done. Now, patent laws in Canada come under federal jurisdiction. So we had no choice in Federal Court of Canada with one judge. And how often we wished later on that we could have had a judge and jury where farmers would be on that jury that knew and understood farming, but that was not to be. So it took 2 years to go to court. And I won't go into too much details, but in the 2 years before the court, in the examination, the discoveries, and so on, Monsanto also agreed that they had no knowledge that we had ever obtained their seed or used their own seed, but the fact that we were contaminated by our neighbor, then we had no right to our seeds or plants again. We should not have used them. So that was the basis of what it went to court. Now, what the judge ruled, and you have to remember this was the first case in the world where the patents on genes was brought forward. And what the judge ruled is what made the case become internationally known overnight in his ruling. And I'll just give you some of the rulings. He ruled, first of all, it does not matter how anyone, in our case, a farmer, is contaminated with GMOs. And he went on to say how that could happen, cross-pollination, through pollen flow, wind, and so on, or direct seed movement, with seeds blown in the wind, or transportation by farmers. And he said if that happens to any farmer, a farmer no longer owns the seeds or plants. Under patent law, they become the ownership of Monsanto. The other thing he ruled is that all our research and development, because of the contamination now belongs to Monsanto, and we had to deliver up any of our seeds or plants that we had developed to Monsanto. He also ruled level of contamination did not matter. If it was 1% or 2% or 5%, you no longer own your seeds or plants, and you're not allowed to use them again. So that was devastating to us. And we then decided that we would fight Monsanto as long as we could. And then we went to Federal Court of Appeal, 3 judges, and eventually it ended up in the Supreme Court of Canada. Now, at the Supreme Court of Canada, we could bring in other issues besides the patent infringement. And I'll read, and I think these are very important. Some of the other issues we brought forward as a farmer and a consumer. First of all, can living organisms, seeds, plants, genes, human organs be owned and protected by corporate patents on intellectual property? That was one of the issues. Can farmers' right to grow conventional or organic crops be protected? Another one, can farmers keep the ancient right to save their own seeds, use their own seeds, or develop them further if they so desire to do so? But I think by the time it went to the Supreme Court, after 7 years, one of the most important issues was this: who owns life? Has any corporation, any individual, the right to put a patent on a gene that controls the future of life? We said that life is sacred, and no one should be able to have the right to control the future of life. So those were some of the main issues before the Supreme Court of Canada, besides the patent infringement issue. But there's 2 other lawsuits that a lot of people don't know about, that Monsanto also laid against us in the 7 years of legal battle with them. And this is the 2 other lawsuits Monsanto laid against us. About halfway through, Monsanto laid another lawsuit of $1 million against my wife and myself because they wanted all their legal expense paid up to a certain period of time. Because they had said at that time, because we were stubborn, we were arrogant, And we wouldn't do what Monsanto wanted. They wanted all their legal expenses to be paid up to that point in time. So that was the second lawsuit. The third lawsuit, when Monsanto found out how we were financing our legal bills, we had been taking out mortgages on our farmland to pay our legal costs. And when Monsanto found that out, they then tried to seize, through KVS and liens, all our farmland. They tried to seize our house and all our farm equipment. They did everything to try and stop us. So those were the three lawsuits that were against us at the Supreme Court that Monsanto had laid. Now, what did the Supreme Court rule? First of all, just briefly, they ruled that we would not have to pay Monsanto no money whatsoever. But what was not fair, the Supreme Court ruled Monsanto has to pay their legal bill, which was around $2 million. My wife and I would have to pay our own legal bill, which was about $500,000. Remember, Monsanto laid the lawsuit against us. They lost, and they should have had to pay the court should have ruled that they also would have to pay our legal expense. But that was not to be. Now, what about the issue of who owns life and all the other issues that we brought forward? And this is the ruling of the Supreme Court. Monsanto's patent on a gene is valid. Wherever that gene arises in any higher life form, they own and control that higher life form. Supreme Court then went on to say that it should go back to the Parliament of Canada to bring in new laws, first of all to protect farmers' rights and whether you can put a patent on a gene. Remember, there is nothing in the Patent Act of Canada that you can patent a gene. So that was never addressed by our federal government, and the Supreme Court said it should be addressed, and up to now it's only a judge's ruling whether you can put a patent on a gene or not. But it raises some other very important issues. If you can put a patent on a seed, which is classified as a higher life form, where do you stop? Bird, bee, animal, fish, and even what about a human being? So there are some major issues, both morally and ethical issues that we are rising at. And these issues have not been addressed yet by the federal government. Now, we thought at that time that it was now over for us with Monsanto. But little did we know 2 years later that we did not grow canola anymore after the Supreme Court ruling, or in fact, since Monsanto laid the lawsuit against us. And we then thought we would start doing experimental work developing new varieties of mustard, because many years ago my wife and I did grow yellow mustard. And one day we found canola plants growing in one of our fields where we're doing this research. And Monsanto had said continuously there in all the court trials that if anything is sprayed with Monsanto's herbicide Roundup, and any green thing is sprayed with that, and it doesn't die, it's Monsanto's gene that is in that plant. So we did some testing, and we were quite sure that it was Monsanto's GMO canola. And we notified Monsanto, and when Monsanto indeed came out, did testing, and 2 days later they came back to us and said, yes, those canola plants in that research field is Monsanto's GMOs. And they asked my wife and I what we wanted to have done with the contamination. And because we didn't want the pods to go fully mature, we said to Monsanto we want every grapeseed plant on those 50 acres pulled out by hand. And Monsanto agreed to do this. And 2 days later, my wife gets a fax from Monsanto, and if I ever saw my wife upset, that was one time. And this is what it said. My wife and I, it was a release document. We would have to sign this release form. And this is what it said. My wife and myself, or any member of our family, could never ever take Monsanto to court again for the rest of our lives, no matter how much they contaminate us again on that land. The second item they wanted to have us sign was that we could not speak publicly. I couldn't even speak here this evening to you that our freedom of speech would be taken away. In other words, any member of our family, we could never ever talk what Monsanto agreed to do for the contamination cleanup. And my wife, as I said, was pretty upset over this, and so was I when I come home. And we said to Monsanto, so many people in our country gave their lives for the freedom of speech. We will never give up our freedom of speech to a corporation. And so we would not sign it. Well, then the battle began. Monsanto said, if you don't sign it, we won't remove the plants. And then we notified Monsanto, said, with the help of our neighbors, we will remove the contamination. And then we really got a nasty letter from or a fax from Monsanto, and it said this: we wish to remind you, Mr. and Mrs. Schmeiser, that those plants, those canola plants on your field are not your property. They're our property under patent law, and you can't do with them what you want. And believe me, we went ahead and notified Monsanto we are going to remove them, and we did with the help of our neighbors, and when we were done, we sent Monsanto the bill. Monsanto refused to pay the bill, and it was only $640, but we paid our neighbors, and Monsanto refused to pay it unless we signed a document. So then, we finally, after 1 year, when Monsanto wouldn't pay it, we took Monsanto to court, and it was small claims court. The judge agreed with us, and we had Monsanto in court, $1 billion corporation plus on a $640 bill. So, and when the court started, Monsanto's lawyers got up and agreed to pay the $640 and the $20 cost. So that was a major, major victory. It was not the $640, but it was the whole idea: if you contaminate under patent law, or you contaminate because you have a patent on a gene, you should be liable for the damages you do when you put it into the environment, when you know you cannot control it. So, as I said, it was not only a victory for ourselves, but it was a victory for thousands of people, farmers around the world. There is now an avenue, or a precedent has been set. If you are contaminated, whether it's Bayer, Syngenta, or Monsanto, you can take a company to court. Now, if you're an organic farmer, and it might take you 3-4 years to be recertified if you're contaminated, what happens with your income for the next 3-4 years? So those are all things that have to be looked at. So that is basically the court case. Now, what are some of the things that happen? First of all, there are really two types of GMOs. There's the herbicide-resistant GMO, and there's the Bt toxin GMOs. And the one that we are more familiar here in Western Canada is the herbicide-resistant GMOs, which is resistant to Monsanto's herbicide Roundup. And the other one where a Bt toxin is put in, and that's primarily in Bt corn, Bt cotton, Bt potatoes, where a toxin is put into the seed or into the plant, and if an insect eats any cell of that plant, it will die. And also then with the herbicide-resistant plant, if you spray Roundup, the plant is resistant to that herbicide Roundup. There's other GMO plants from other companies also out, but I won't mention them. So those are the two types of GMOs. The most common one in Western Canada is naturally the herbicide-resistant GMO. But what they don't tell you, there's also another issue that I did not mention, is the whole issue now of the environment, and also the whole issue of eating GMOs. And I won't go too much into that. But remember that when you eat GMO foods, you're eating a new virus, a new toxin, or a new bacteria that was never ever in your food before. So besides the gene that makes that plant resistant to a chemical, you're also eating a new virus or bacteria, because the reason for that is to transfer that gene from one life form to another to make that plant resistant to a certain herbicide. You have to use promoters or vectors, as we call them, and which are either a virus or a bacteria. But in the case of canola, you have to use an antibiotic-resistant marker gene that was never in your canola before. And that has vast implications, because now in the pollination stage, many of our farmers are breathing in an antibiotic-resistant marker gene, and I won't go into the details of that, the effects on human health by breathing in an antibiotic. So those are some of the important issues by eating or consuming GMOs, which you never ever hear about, the two types. Which is the worst one? In my opinion, the one with the Bt toxins in. Because if it can kill an insect, if it eats any cell of that plant, what does it do to you when you eat food with the Bt toxin in? I've been at many meetings and where Monsanto's people have been present, and he said, well, it's such a little bit of toxin, it won't hurt you. But what they don't tell you, it builds up in your body over a period of time. Now, what else has happened with GMOs, especially in Western Canada? First of all, we have found there is absolutely no coexistence. And when I went to Europe, started going to Europe a number of years back, I still would hear that. Farmers have a choice. You can have GMOs, you can have organic farmers, you can have conventional farmers in the same country. That is absolutely impossible. It all becomes GMOs after a few years. So you no longer have a choice. In Canada here, in Western Canada, we no longer, you'd be hard-pressed to find any seed, any canola seed that is not GMOs. It is now all contaminated. And as a result of that, we cannot sell our canola to many, many countries of the world because of the contamination. I don't think there's any pure soya left in Canada. It's all GMOs. If you went out to buy non-GMO, or an organic farmer wanted to buy non-GMO seed, it's impossible to find. Now, there's something else that happens that they never ever tell you about. GMOs do not only affect the plant that you put that GMO gene in. Most plants come from a family of plants, and especially canola comes from the brassica family. And in that family, you have many relatives and distant cousins, close relatives, radishes, turnips, cauliflower, broccoli, wild mustard, and so on. And through cross-pollination from the GMO canola, it's now going more into those market garden crops, making more crops you no longer can raise organically or conventionally. And that's why there was such an uproar in Canada 4 years ago, when they wanted to introduce GMOs into wheat. And if wheat would ever be, GMOs would ever be introduced in wheat, it would totally destroy the organic farmer because wheat comes from the grass family. And that's why we have said we want no more GMOs introduced into Canada. So those are some of the main issues. Now, GMOs were never ever meant to increase yields or be more nutritious. It was meant to get control of the world seed supply. That's what it was all about, and with control of the seed supply, it's control of the food supply. And if you look at Monsanto's earnings just for the last 3 months, or last quarter, is that most of their profit now comes from the seed business. Monsanto now is the largest seed company in the world. They've gone from a chemical company to the world's largest seed company, as I said. And the worst part of it, Monsanto's been buying up a lot of organic farmers, especially on the West Coast, British Columbia, Oregon, especially California, where it's very difficult now for organic farmers to get a lot of types of organic seed. They're now having to go to Europe, especially Germany, to get new types or different types of organic seed because of Monsanto's purchasing a lot of these organic seed companies. So it's all about the control of the seed and food supply. There's many other issues that are not mentioned. We do not have labeling in North America. We do not know what's in our food. And I think that's a drastic violation of human rights when we don't know what we're eating, what we're feeding our children or our grandchildren. And 3 or 4 years ago, we took Canada for violations of human rights to the United Nations in Geneva. Those charges against Monsanto, against the government of Canada, and the violations of human rights has still not been addressed by Canada's federal government. So those are some of the things that we have done to bring this item forward about the violations of human rights. What else has happened in the control the companies use to control the future of seeds? And it's a terminator gene that they tried to bring into Canada 3 years ago, primarily Monsanto. And the terminator gene, for the people here that don't know, it's a gene that's put into a seed. When the seed becomes a plant, all the seeds from that plant are sterile. So the farmer is forced to go back and buy the seed the following year. But what is not told, the germination, is that through cross-pollination of the terminator gene, it can go into indigenous plants and heirloom plants, so basically it can terminate the life or the future germination of your seed. So that would give them total control of the seed supply. They wouldn't have to mess around with contracts and everything else to control the farmers. To me, I've often said, it's the greatest assault we've ever seen on life on this planet ever before. When they call themselves life science company comes out with a gene that will terminate the future of life. And thank God it was not allowed in Canada, but they're promoting it in many other countries of the world, especially third world countries. And that brings me to the issue, how does it affect third world countries? Countries in Africa, India, Bangladesh. And I've spent a lot of time in those countries. How do you think a farmer in those countries can afford to buy his seed each year? Then he's forced to buy the chemicals. He's forced to pay a license fee on each hectare or each acre that he farms. So those farmers are totally under the domination of a corporation, in this case, Monsanto. Now, I think I've spoken enough about those issues. But there's a real social issue that arises with the introduction of GMOs. And a lot of people are not aware, even in our country, of what these corporations, especially Monsanto, is doing to the social fabric of our rural communities. First of all, just briefly, this is one of the contracts of Monsanto. And to me, it's one of the most vicious contracts that a farmer ever could sign. And you may ask yourself, why did a farmer ever sign this in the beginning? First of all, a farmer must always buy the seed each year from Monsanto. He must buy the chemicals from Monsanto. He must pay Monsanto a license fee of $15 on every acre that he seeds that canola or any other GMO crop. But the worst thing on this contract is that he must permit Monsanto's police or investigators to come onto his land 3 years after he signs this contract. And they can go onto a farmer's field without a permission. They go into a farmer's granary. They can get a farmer's tax records and farming records. And if something goes wrong with the seed and he has a complaint against Monsanto, a farmer can never talk to the press about it. In fact, his freedom of speech is taken away. And another clause that has been introduced into just in the last 2 years, a farmer never can take Monsanto to court with this document. So farmers' rights are totally gone. Now, why did farmers sign it at the beginning? The order form was one side, the contract was on the other side. A lot of farmers never read it. They signed it before it was too late. And a lot of times when that was faxed to a farmer, just to one side the order form was sent to the farmer, and he never read the other side of the contract. But now it does not matter whether a farmer signs the contract or not. If you are contaminated to what the court ruled in our case, and you're contaminated, you fall under the same conditions as if you signed the contract. The other thing now, if you buy a bag of seed, on the side of the bag there's a statement, it's printed. By opening up this bag of seed, you agree to all of the terms and conditions of Monsanto's patent law number so-and-so. So it doesn't matter whether you signed the contract or not now. You come under the thumb of Monsanto, whether you're contaminated or by seed. Now, I mentioned about the social fabric. I think this is the worst one, and very few people have seen this, but they used to advertise this in their farm papers and in our Western Producer and other farm papers, and they also, in the United States, advertise this on the radio. And this is actually a Monsanto brochure. And here it states, if you as a farmer think your neighbor is growing Monsanto's GMOs without a license, report your neighbor to us and we will give you a free gift. We don't know, and this is real. And when Monsanto gets this information from a farmer for whatever reason that he did this against his neighbor. They immediately send out 2 of their investigators or police who are Monsanto's police. They went under the name of Robinson Investigation in Saskatchewan, and 2 years ago they had 35 ex-RCMP that they had hired to do nothing but investigate and interrogate farmers. But anyway, they immediately send 2 of their investigators to a farmer's home. And they'll say to a farmer, we have this tip or rumor you're growing our GMOs without a license. And a farmer will say, I'm an organic farmer. I'm a conventional farmer. There's no way we want GMOs. And they'll say to a farmer, you're lying. If you don't confess, we'll take you to court and you won't have a farm left. So when these gene police leave, as we call them, leave a farmer's home, what do you think a farmer thinks? Which neighbor caused me this trouble? So now you have a suspicion, a breakdown of farmers not trusting one another. And believe me, this is real. So it's a breakdown of our real social fabric. And believe me, our grandparents and our parents had to work long and hard to open this country and work together with our neighbors to build our schools, hospitals, roads, churches. Now we have the breakdown of our real social fabric by one of Monsanto's policy. And to me, as I said, I think this is one of the worst things that could have happened with the introduction of GMOs, a breakdown of our world social fabric. So those were some of the issues. There's many other issues that maybe you're not aware of. There are also now what we call pharma plants, started about 5 years ago, where prescription type drugs are now being produced by plants. And it's being done in the open and in the wild. And I'll give you some of the major drugs that are being produced in the wild, in the open, and to me, I think that was absolutely criminal of both our federal government and the U.S. to allow this to be done in the wild or in the open. So it's bad enough to eat a food with a genetic altered gene in it, or a gene transfer. Now you have drugs that are being produced by plants. Now I'll give you some of the major drugs being produced by plants at the present time. There could be more. First of all, industrial enzymes. Number 2, blood thinners. Number 3, blood clotting proteins, growth hormones, contraceptives, and so on. Now, I was at a meeting last year in California where there were doctors from Oregon gave quite a presentation about these pharma plants or pharmaceutical plants. And he gave examples. He said, if a woman is pregnant, and then she eats a food laced with a contraceptive drug in, what are the results? If you had some major surgery and you come home from the hospital and then eat food with a blood thinner in. So those are other things that's in our food that we're not even told about. But this is what's happening. So those are major, major issues when you introduce GMOs. The environment. The massive increased use of chemicals because of the new superweed. And what is a superweed really? Back in 1996, Monsanto was not the only company, but they were the biggest company at that time to introduce GMOs. But you had other varieties, Liberty Link, Pursuit Smart. And after the first year, already through the cross-pollination, you had 3 of those genes in one plant, in one canola plant, and that's what was called then the new superweed, because it took a new variety or new powerful new chemicals to try and control that new superweed. And that's what's referred to as superweed, when the genes from at least 3 companies that were selling GMOs are now in one plant. And that's throughout our whole Western Canada now, that new superweed, where you have to use more chemicals than ever before. So more harm to the human health, and also now to the environment with increased chemical use and more powerful chemicals. What about the economic issue? Many of you don't know we cannot sell any of our rapeseed or canola to Europe because of the GMO contamination. Not long ago, in fact about a year ago to the day, in Germany they found out that the flax that we were sending to Europe was also contaminated with GMOs. And flax was never given regulatory approval. GMO flax was never given regulatory approval. Where did the GMO flax come from? In 2001, 2002, at University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon, they were developing, scientist's name was Alan McEwen, GMO flax. When this was all found out, the federal government ordered the university to destroy. They had enough GMO flax developed to seed 60,000 acres to destroy all the GMO flax, which was done. But what Alan McEwen did, he was the scientist involved, he went and took packages that had approximately between 140 to 150 seeds in a package. And he went out to our high schools, and a good portion, especially around Saskatchewan, and went out to high schools and gave them to the students and said, this is a new variety of flax we developed at the University of Saskatchewan. And he never told them that it was GMO flax. When it was found out what he was doing, there was a recall of all those packages as much as possible from the students that he had given it out to. But apparently not all come out, because now our flax is contaminated. It's called trifid flax. It's even moved into the United States. So contamination doesn't only move by cross-pollination, direct seed movement. If you have a scientist that's dishonest, you can also have contamination, and that's now what has happened with our flax. Our flax shipments now to Europe have been basically cut off. We ship 80% of what we produce to Europe, and hopefully there's testing being done to see if it all is contaminated, and maybe some of that market be again obtained. Our honey, another industry that's really been hurt. Many countries of the world do not buy our honey because of the contamination, because the bee doesn't know which flower is GMO and which is not. So that's another industry that has been hurt severely. What about the input costs to a farmer now? If a farmer could use his own seed, I'll give you an example of that. When a farmer could use his own canola seed, it approximately would cost him 90 cents an acre. Now when he's forced to buy that canola seed from the company, the GMO canola, it costs him approximately $50 an acre for seed, plus he has to pay a $15 an acre license fee, plus he has to buy the chemicals from Monsanto. So you can see what the input costs have gone up to farmers. Farmers no longer have a choice. Choice is gone. One thing I'm very concerned, and I'm speaking at a university this evening, is our academic freedom. My wife and I have 15 children, 5 children, 15 grandchildren, and 3 grandchildren. Many of our grandchildren are in university. What kind of an academic freedom are they going to have when so much of our funding to our universities now come from corporations? And that funding goes to projects that these corporations want. And the results of that research a lot of times is not allowed to be made public because of the corporation's involvement and the payment of these funds. To me, that has to stop. If we want to maintain academic freedom of our universities, funding has to go back to the federal or the public purse and not from corporations, because we will not get a true scientific research done if it's controlled by corporations, because the results of that information will not be made public. And that has happened. I don't think there's one land-grant college left in the United States that doesn't, to some degree, receive funding from a corporation. In Canada, I think almost every university, to some degree, will get certain types of funding from the corporations. So you lose control of your university. The universities were built by the public purse, by you and I. A corporation comes in and gives a certain amount for a certain program, and basically gets control of that university in that certain field or research. That has to stop. And that's what I'm concerned about our grandchildren. When they graduate, how much academic freedom are they going to have when they graduate? So those are some of the most important issues. I could go on to many others that I'm very concerned about. And I mentioned the contracts. I mentioned some of the methods that Monsanto's used. It was not easy for my wife and I to stand up for Monsanto for 10, 12 legal years of battle. They did everything to destroy us, as I mentioned, with lawsuits, but there was more to do than that. They threatened us. They would watch us when we worked in our fields, and not only us, many hundreds of other farmers. And they would come into our driveway, and they would watch what my wife would be doing all day. They never did anything, but just to intimidate us and to put the fear of what they could do to us. They would go to our neighbors and said, if you support the Schmeisers, we're going to come after you, and you will do the same thing to you as we're doing to them. So those are some of the things. I'm not talking about third world countries. I'm talking about a first world country. A lot of us thought this never could happen to us in a first world country. And believe me, it is happening to us, and it's happening to us today yet. So our freedoms are being taken away. To me, they almost are showing more power. Corporations are now showing more power, or have more power than our governments or the corporations are doing things that the governments wouldn't even dare to do, to try and take away your personal freedom and the freedom of a farmer to always use his own seed. Because I think we were seed developers, we were very concerned of the loss of biodiversity, and we realized that if you ever get down to one variety of seeds or plants, and you have some disease, some disaster, you've got nothing to fall back on. And if you look at what has happened to the potatoes in Ireland in the 1850s, that's what could happen to us now, especially in corn, with at least half the 10,000 varieties of corn or maize in Mexico is now contaminated with GMOs. So we are very concerned of the loss of biodiversity, and I think we realize that more because we were seed developers. So, first of all, another very important point. With the introduction of GMOs, it's the end of organic farming as we know it today. We've lost our organic farmers' ability to grow organic canola in Canada or organic soya. And also, I would believe now it's coming also to sugar beets. We're going to lose that. So the choice is gone. So if you want to destroy the organic farming in this world, just keep introducing GMOs. And that's why we have to stand up that no more new GMOs are ever introduced. I've talked this over with many scientists. I've just come back from Japan with meetings with scientists in Japan on the issue, can you ever bring back a life form or a GMO back out of the environment once you introduce it? And the word that I got is that at the present time they don't know. Scientists don't know if you ever can bring back a new life form once you introduce it in the environment. And they gave examples. You can have an oil spill, you can have a chemical spill. Eventually, you can clean it up. But a genetic spill or a new genetic gene into the environment, they don't know. And that's why it's so serious that we do not introduce it in the first place. The precautionary principle was never ever used because it was classified that it was substantially equivalent. It was introduced in Canada with any testing. No testing was done by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. They only used the information supplied to them by Monsanto. I should give you an example of that testing of Monsanto. I took all the documentation supplied by Monsanto to the Government of Canada, to the School of Science in Japan, and they redid all that experimentation. And the report was 500 pages long of that, what the research they did, redoing the research that Monsanto had supplied. And in their report to the Health Ministry of Japan, and I have it with me tonight, they said that all the documentation supplied to the Government of Canada, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, was fraudulent and falsified. And yet, it was introduced with any testing done by our Canadian Food Inspection Agency. I have forwarded this all to the government. I've had no reply back on it as yet. So when they say the government of Canada has approved it, but they only approved it on the documentation submitted to them by Monsanto. I think I have enough time to speak a little bit. I'm very concerned about the health issue. For the first time, there's many now experiments have been come forward, especially from Russia, and also from Germany, from England. And one of the first reports coming out of the United States, one of the first ones, and it comes from the American Academy of Environmental Medicine. And they have some very alerts in this, and they, amongst other things. And he said pregnant women and children should immediately stop eating GMO foods. How can we do that in North America when we don't have labeling in our food? They estimate that there's 64 foods in Canada now to some degree have GMOs in. So they go on to many other things now, like the Russians, the Germans, the Americans now have stated that higher, like your fertility rate really goes down, mortality rate really goes up, and many other types of ailments. These reports are all available, and now that has become one of the biggest concerns in Europe at the present time, is now the whole issue, the effects of eating GMOs on human health. And so I won't go any more into that on the human health issue, but these are all available. The Russians have done it. The two famous scientists in Russia have done it both on mice. They have done it on animals. And so no longer it's done only on rats and mice, but on other animals. One of the scientists from the University of Guelph, by the name of Van Clark, has done a lot of research on the effects of eating GMOs, especially on our young growing adults, male adults. And they have found that the sperm count is down almost 50% since GMOs have been introduced in Canada. So we have major concerns on the health issue, and especially the European people, and that's why they will not introduce the GMOs. It is not permitted at the present time. But what has happened, they have permitted GMO feed come in from Brazil and the US. And at the beginning, we were told that there was no horizontal transfer of GMOs in a body, in a human body or an animal. And by that, they said it would pass through. And that is totally false. GMOs do not all pass through. There is horizontal transfer. It'll go into your intestines, into your bloodstream, and then into the meat or your body. So if you eat the flesh of an animal fed GMOs, you are eating GMOs. And that's what the Europeans have become really concerned about now when they found this out. So anything that, any animal, any human that eats GMOs, you have a buildup of those GMO genes in your body. And I gave you an example before, a new virus, a new bacteria that was never in your food before you are now eating. First of all, then, to recap, number one, there is no such thing as containment. You cannot control pollen flow. And when I used to go to Europe and I'd hear the companies say all they had to do in Europe is leave a buffer strip of 15 meters or 30 meters and it was safe. I don't care if you leave a 100-kilometer buffer strip, it's going to spread. You can't control pollen, birds flying, and so on, or seed movement. So there is no containment and there is no coexistence. It all becomes GMOs because it's a dominant gene and will take over whatever seeds or plants it gets into. I mentioned the flax issue, the superweeds, the labeling, terminator gene. There is another gene that is out that very few know about, and we call it the new cheater gene. And that cheater gene works in conjunction with the terminator gene. I should maybe just tell you about how the cheater gene works. It's put into a seed along with the terminator gene, and the seed becomes a plant. The plant with the with the cheater gene in will not produce a seed until you spray a chemical on. When you spray the chemical on, it produces the seed, and then the terminator gene kicks in, renders that seed sterile. I'm not talking about science fiction. I'm talking about what is here now and what they've been trying to introduce to get control of that world seed supply. And yet, in Canada, we hardly hear any of our press talk about what I'm talking about, but you go to other countries in Europe, go to Japan, go to Germany, go to Austria, go to Luxembourg, Poland, and you hear all about it. It's in their papers, it's on the radios. But how much do we hear about it in Canada? So how much control have the companies got over our press? So as long I know that by standing here this evening and talking to you about this, that Monsanto is going to keep coming after my wife and myself to try and quiet us. We know that. We don't know what all they're going to do to us. They threaten that they're going to destroy us somehow, someday, to keep us quiet. But as long as we can do it, we're going to bring awareness to the world. And that's part of our job now, is to bring awareness to the world and what happens with the introduction of GMOs. All you have to do is go on the internet and you can see and get the information yourself of what I'm talking about here this evening. And look at all the implications. You may not agree with me with a lot of things I said tonight, but go and look at it yourself and make your own conclusions on it. I'm giving you the facts of what has happened to us Canadian farmers. And when I go to Europe or go to Japan or some other Asian country, I don't come there to tell them what to do. I go over there to tell them what has happened to us Canadian farmers, how we lost our freedom in our choice of what the seeds would grow, how organic farmers are losing their choice. And believe me, that's what we want to do as long as we can do it in our lives, to bring that awareness to people, what can happen. First of all, the social issue, the loss of seeds and plants, our loss of biodiversity, damage to the environment, and so on. So those are some of the important issues that I wanted to bring here to you this evening. So again, I sure wish there's questions. There's many issues I did not cover, but I've tried to cover the most important ones, and I hope there's a lot of questions that I can answer. So I want to thank all those involved for bringing my wife in here this evening to Regina to bring you this information and this message. So I hope that you will go out and get a lot more information, speak about what the dangers to the U.S. consumers, U.S. farmers know what the dangers are. We can still do something about it. We don't have to introduce any more new GMOs. We have the 4 major ones, and that I think was bad enough. I think another crop that they really put a lot of pressure on to introduce was rice, GMO rice. Now you say, well, rice, what does it mean to us? It means a lot to us. We have a lot of wild rice in the north. And if that ever gets contaminated, and highly nutritious rice, so that our native population is very concerned in the north that no GMO rice be ever introduced, because it would contaminate our wild rice in the north. So that's an issue that we've really been fighting also, that no GMO rice, no GMO wheat be introduced. So I think with that, I will stop. And again, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you here this evening. Say no to GMOs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Percy, for your passion and your commitment to this fight. I think you've given us all a lot to think about in terms of the effect of GMOs on our everyday life and in our food systems. We're going to open the floor up to questions now. We've got 2 microphones here, one on either side. I just remind everyone to please keep your questions as brief as possible and keep them just that, questions, please. Thank you very much.
Congratulations on a very inspiring speech, Mr. Schmeiser. I was wondering if you have any allies, like either individuals or organizations, to carry on this battle. I know you're getting old and tired.
I don't think my wife and I could have done what we have done without the help of people from all over the world. Organizations, even governments, NGO groups, and so on, individuals, consumers, farmers, that were very, very concerned. So we could not have done it alone. Monsanto might have a lot of people, but believe me, we had an army of world people behind us.
Hi. I just am wondering, like, when I'm back home, my family farms in Alberta, and you know, sometimes I've had, like, my mom, she knows a lot about this stuff, and she's been kicked out of, like, my grandpa's house before over discussions of this. You know, my great uncles were sitting there too, and like scarfing and, you know, snarking. And so I'm just wondering, like, when you're, like, what do you say to people in your family that are like, this is their livelihood, and my grandpa actually kind of tongue-in-cheek confessed to me the other day on the phone, like how he's upset with Monsanto, but that's the first I've ever heard him say anything like that. He would never say that in public. But like, how do you engage? I'm just thinking of my family members and with this topic.
If I go back to 1996, I think if farmers would have known what they know now, it would never have been given the, that people would really have tried it. But if you go back to the financial condition of farmers in 1996, we had some pretty low prices, and farmers were finding any way to try and save the farm. You had families where the wife had an off-farm job, a teacher or a nurse or whatever, and in many cases, both the husband and wife had off-farm jobs, and all of a sudden, you have a corporation come along and it had the magic bullet, so to speak, increase yields, less chemicals, and so on. So farmers were willing to try anything, but believe me, I've talked to many farmers that did go ahead and grow it, that they regretted it, because once you're on that treadmill, you can't get off of it, because once your land is contaminated, and the court ruled, a farmer ought to know or should know his field or his seed is contaminated, he's not allowed to use it. And I think a good way to talk to people now, to farmers, I mentioned, look at the input cost to a farmer now, and yet the yields don't go up. What Monsanto now says is that they don't say anything about increased yields, more nutritious. They now say it's a better tool for farmers to control weeds. Believe me, I've been farming since '46. We did not need the Monsantos of the world to control weeds. So I think you have to look at it from the point of view of what is it doing to our future generations in our health, environment, and so on. I think you have to explain it that way. And are you going to make any more money now with the high input costs?
Sorry, just one more thing. Like, you talked about increasing yields and all this stuff. Like, in the third world, I mean, like, how do you, basically we've made these mistakes, and then I know they've had the so-called green revolution in India and these other places. Like, how do you turn to these people and say, sorry, you can't have these increasing yields and all these things that are benefits of, supposedly benefits, right? So.
Well, if you look at the disaster of the Green Revolution, because once you start using more chemicals, more fertilizers each year, with that Green Revolution, you come to a point now where they're not producing anything more, because you always have to increase your input of those chemicals or fertilizers, because your soil becomes depleted. But what has happened is, in India especially, and I've spent a lot of time in India, is that farmers were talked in with GMOs to grow non-traditional crops. They were called cash crops. And a lot of those turned out to be really a disaster, especially in cotton, where the cotton walls fell off prematurely. So they didn't even have enough money to pay the money lenders or the chemical companies or the seed companies. And the last time I was in India, they told me now they estimated 200,000 people have committed suicide because they cannot pay the companies, the seed companies, because the seed companies had told them, the chemical companies had told them, you grow these cash crops, you'll have so much money, you can buy any food that you want. Well, it didn't work out that way, especially when the yields didn't go up. I can give you some examples of the Department of Agriculture in the U.S. They have said that the yields in canola is down about 10%, yields in soya is down about 15%, U.S. Department of Agriculture. So it does, well, if you just stop to think, how does putting a gene into a plant to make it resistant to a chemical make it increase yield? All it does is to protect that plant if you spray a chemical on. Monsanto's chemical herbicide Roundup. It had nothing to do with increased yields. I've talked to many scientists about increased yields, drought resistance, and so on, and GMOs. And they said if we would put all our efforts starting today, in 25 years from now, they believe we still would not have plants that would increase yields or be more nutritious or also be more higher yielding. They said to do that, you have to totally change the structure of a plant. To make that plant resistant to a chemical, it was quite easy to do, is transferring that gene from one life form to another. But to change the whole structure of the plan and what you will end up with is totally different. I've discussed this a lot with David Suzuki also on this whole issue.
Hello. In respect to your points about Monsanto sending thugs basically to stalk your farm and family and intimidate your neighbors, is there a law currently, or do you think the law could be made to restrict that? And it seems like a lot of people in this room probably understand that Monsanto's behavior is criminal. If they were an individual, if they were doing these sort of things, we'd string them up as a war criminal practically. But because they're a corporation that employs people and provides the holy grail of jobs in today's difficult post 9/11 economy, what could be done?
Well, there are laws. You're not supposed to trespass into somebody's field, which they go ahead and do. And I remember the case with one young farmer in his 20s. He came in to see me and he said, Monsanto's people are in this field, they're taking samples of his canola. And I went out immediately with him and I said to Monsanto's officials, what are you doing here? And the farmer had said to him, you get off, and the Monsanto's official said, make us get off. So I went with him to the sergeant in Humboldt, to the police, and the farmer wanted to lay a charge against Monsanto for trespassing. The sergeant said, look, he said, I just want to let you know, you can lay the charge, but Monsanto's going to fight you tooth and nail. It's going to be how many years in court? Do you have the money to do that? Have you got $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000? So that's what happens, intimidation, and they're getting away with it. Often I say we have a legal system in Canada, but do we really have justice for an average person when you stand up to a corporation? No, we don't. And that's things that have to be changed to give some of the rights, some of the justice back to the average person. We don't have it when you fight a corporation. And believe me, I found that out too.
Thank you very much for enlightening us about this subject. I couldn't help but thinking that when you go to Ottawa, everybody must run. I mean, believe it. Oh, here comes Percy, let's get out of here. But trying to make a little humor. But you talked about losing one of those court battles and facing $500,000 of legal fees. And I'm not asking you if you don't want to, but how did you survive that? How did you stay on the farm?
Okay, I'll tell you personally about my wife and I were both in retirement age. We were over 65 years of age, so we had to use a lot of our retirement funds, which we did. And then we started putting mortgages on our land, and that's when Monsanto found out how we were financing it. Then they tried to seize our land and our farm equipment, even our house. And then we had, I would say, out of that $500,000, we had about $200,000 in donations from people around the world, from every continent. And a lot of that was small donations, $25, $30, $50 from people. Sure, there were larger organizations like the Farmers Union, or organizations in the United States or Germany or England, and so that helped us, and individuals. But the bulk of the money came from individuals like you and I. And that's how, and thank God we had the internet. And that's just when Monsanto laid the lawsuit against us. That's just when back in 1998, when the internet was really starting. So otherwise we could never have done it. And I'll never forget the morning we knew 2 days in advance when the decision from the Supreme Court would be coming down, and we decided where would be the best place to hear what the verdict was. And we decided to go to Saskatchewan to our lawyer, which had handled the case all the way. And I'll never forget going out of our house, my wife turning around and looking, and she says, I hope we have a roof over our head when we come home tonight. If we would have lost the Supreme Court, our house would have been padlocked within an hour. That's how close we were to losing everything we had. So Many times I thought, you know, I'd come home from speaking in different parts of the world to my wife, and I thought, my God, what am I doing to my neighbors, my wife, my family, by putting them in all this pressure all the time? And I was ready to give up, but I had the support of my family, support of my wife. Don't give up. We have to stand up for the rights of people. And I could not have done it without my family, and my wife especially.